You guys see that okay?
Yep.
Okay,
I can see it.
great, thanks. Okay, so first of all, thanks for inviting me to do this presentation. So what I'm going to discuss tonight is what's called the Rodgers aerial post, and I'll obviously get into that. But it's also wrapped around a part of American history that's not well known, which is the flight of the Vin Fiz. So I hope through this discussion you'll appreciate both the history of aviation in America as well as the Rodgers aerial post.
Excuse me, Todd, can you turn the volume up a bit?
I can try. Yeah, keep going, Charlie. I'll work on the volume while you're
Okay.
talking.
So there's three parts to the story. The story takes place in the early 1900s, 1911 to be exact. So it's shortly after the first motorized flight by the Wright brothers. So just like artificial intelligence today is a technology trend that everybody's interested in, aviation was that in the early 1900s. So the story is wrapped around a lot of the early part of the United States and worldwide aviation history. There's a person involved, Cal Rodgers, and we'll introduce him in a minute, but he undertakes an extraordinary adventure. And since we're stamp collectors, part of this is the creation of what's called the Rodgers aerial post and the flight of the Vin Fiz. So all of these combine together to tell this story. So how does it begin? So sort of the catalyst behind all of this is that, again, around 1910, aviation is in its infancy, and around the world, especially in Europe, there are a number of events that occur in the early 1900s that move aviation forward. And one of the events that occurs quite a bit early in Europe is the notion of these international air shows, which obviously still exist. And the first one occurred in America in 1910 in Los Angeles. And, an air show, various vendors, various companies come to show off what they're working on, and there are a number of competitions that go on. But something very interesting happened at the Los Angeles show. William Randolph Hearst was present, the head of the Hearst newspapers, and he took a flight with French aviator Louis Paulin, and he became enamored with aviation and airplanes. And what he did was he offered what was called the Hearst Transcontinental Prize, which was quite simply, it challenged someone to fly across the United States and do it under a certain set of conditions. And if they did that, there would be a prize of $50,000, which is worth about $1.5 million today. And the stipulations were the flight had to be completed by the end of October 1911. The flight had to take a total of 30 days. Chicago was a required stop, and it had to start either in New York or Boston and end or begin in Los Angeles or San Francisco. So this really ignites a lot of interest in aviation in the United States, and a variety of people start to examine whether they want to participate or how they participate in competing for what's called the Hearst Prize. So this is where we meet Cal Perry Rodgers. Now, I'll describe him in a little bit more detail, but first, his background comes from a set of prominent American families. John Rodgers, who was one of the fathers of the U.S. Navy, and Matthew and Oliver Hazard Perry, who were famous naval officers. These are part of his family. Now, he was born in Pittsburgh in 1879, but his father was accidentally killed before he was born. In fact, his father was a captain in the U.S. Army, and he was killed by a lightning strike while serving in the United States Army in the western part of the country. Now, his mother her name is Maria Chambers Rodgers Schweitzer, and, she becomes an important part to this story. Now, Cal Rodgers suffered from scarlet fever at a young age and lost his hearing. And in fact, that becomes a benefit when you're flying planes back in 1911. But he's not able to join the family business, which is the military service. So like a lot of, we hear a lot of stories about, affluent people during this period of time. They're adventurers, they're avid sports people, and the like. And Cal Rodgers kind of falls into this category. He meets a woman, Mabel Avis Graves, and they marry. But, at the end of the day, he's really a sportsman, a yachtsman. And, Mabel is quoted as saying, I suspect he probably likes his machines more than he likes me. But he becomes the main character in our story. And this is a little bit about his background. Now, how does he get into aviation? So the Wright brothers created a flying school near Dayton, Ohio, and again around, it actually come into creation around 1910. And Cal's cousin John, who was in the U.S. Navy, again following the family business, he is chosen by the Navy to be the one naval officer who will go to the Wright School to learn how to fly, because the Navy wants to understand the potential benefits of aviation and serving the country. So John Rodgers, his cousin, is given this task, and while he's there, he encourages his cousin Cal to come join him at the flying school. And he's quoted as saying, for speed you can't beat flying. And Cal enrolls because of his interest of being an adventurer. And he's actually taught to fly by Orville Wright and another gentleman, Arthur Welsh. Now, he becomes, very proficient at it. In fact, the first week, he learns how to take off landing, but he's not allowed to do it solo yet. So, he decides, well, I'm going to buy a plane. And he becomes the first private owner of an airplane in the United States, a Wright Flyer Model B. And at the end of August, he receives his pilot's license, the 49th issued in the world. Now, he also hires a person named Charles Wiggin to help him, maintain his plane, and he becomes another character in the story that we'll talk about. Now, in this picture, that's Orville Wright at the Wright Flying School, and this other person standing here, his name's Charlie Taylor. He's the Wright Company mechanic, and again, he'll become an important part to the story as we go on. So now Cal has a plane. He has his pilot's license. It's the summer of 1911. And what he does is he goes to the Chicago International Aviation Meet because he wants to now demonstrate some of his skills and compete in some of these competitions. And in fact, he's quite successful because he wins a number of prizes, especially the coveted duration prize, which means, staying aloft for the longest period of time. And here's, in fact, a picture of him flying over Lake Michigan during the meet. But while in Chicago, along with Mabel, he visits her family in Wisconsin. He's introduced to a person named Fred Wettengel, and he becomes Cal's publicist and manager. And by this point in time, Cal is interested in pursuing the Hearst Prize, but now he's got to figure out how to do it. As you can imagine, there's a lot of expense associated with doing something like this. So what happens is Carl and Fred Wettengel meet with J. Ogden Armour, the head of the Armour, what we know today as Armour Packaging Company, but they were selling a number of food products at this point in time. And Carl demonstrates again how aviation is really at the forefront. He does this while meeting with Armour and Mabel's family up in Wisconsin. And they come to an agreement where Armour agrees to fund Cal's Hearst Prize attempt, but what he wants in return is he wants Cal to promote a grape drink that they're just introducing called the Vin Fiz sparkling grape drink. And think of it is that Cal basically becomes a flying billboard for Vin Fiz, and he agrees to a fee of receiving $5 for each mile he travels east of the Mississippi, $4 west. And the reason there's a difference there is because the population density was much higher east of the Mississippi, so it was worth more. And so the logo is going to appear on this plane, and Cal is responsible for his maintenance, though. And this becomes, another important part of the story that we'll come to as we go through it. Now, that flyer you see up there is a flyer, a Vin Fiz flyer. And again, it shows a pilot, and that pilot is Harriet Quimby, who is a famous female pilot at this point in time. And she also helps promote the Vin Fiz. And in fact, you can see her in her famous purple aviation suit, which obviously is linked to the grape drink. So what's going on here is that the Armour Company wants to associate their product with interesting new technical advancements, and they tie it to this aviation event with Cal Rodgers and the flight of the Vin Fiz. Now, Cal will drop promotional leaflets as he's flying as well. In fact, this is a picture of one of those promotional leaflets that I took last year when I was at the Smithsonian Stamp Museum. So how do they get going here? So, you know, this is a pretty significant undertaking. So he has the plane, the Wright Flyer Extend EX, which was a version of the plane that was designed for extended distances. But they also have a set of rail cars that are going to follow him while he travels. And this is called the Vin Fiz Special. This is for living, to accommodate the various people that have to travel with him. And one car is nothing but a workshop. And in fact, that workshop has enough spare parts in it to build a plane from scratch if they needed to do it. They also had a car along with them. So if someone had to go find Cal, who was away from train tracks, they were able to deploy this sports car at the time. So it's a pretty significant logistical undertaking. Charlie Taylor joins them on loan from the Wrights to be the mechanic for him, and Charles Wiggins provides additional support. Mabel and Carl's mother go along with a variety of other Vin Fiz executives and Fred Whittingale as well. Now, how is this whole thing planned? Well, his cousin, John Rodgers, becomes a significant person in the entourage, if you will, helping plan this trip and executing it. And in fact, John uses information that he, you know, obtained with the support of the Navy to help plan the trip. Now, if you think about this for a minute, this is 1911. There's no radio. There's no airports. There's no runways. There really is no infrastructure in order to plan a trip like this. So what they decide to do is they're going to use the railroad tracks across the United States as their primary navigation aid, and they do a variety of they do a variety of things in order to make sure that they can identify which train tracks he's supposed to follow and so forth. This becomes a very intricate planning event that John Rodgers leads. So basically, the way in which Cal Rodgers plans to fly across the United States is to go from east to west, going through a southerly route to basically avoid having to go over the Rockies. So he's going to head from New York, from Sheepshead Bay, New York. He's going to stop in Chicago. That's a required stop. He's going to fly through Kansas City because Cal Rodgers has family there, heading to San Antonio before he heads west, going through El Paso on to Pasadena. So this is the route he plans to take. Now, if you were to map this out, this is over 4,000 miles, so it's not, quote unquote, the direct line east to west. But it was impossible for him to fly over the Rockies, given the plane itself and just the primitive nature in which he was trying to achieve this pretty audacious goal. So the takeoff is planned, and it happens on September 17th in Sheephead, New York. And in this postcard at the time, you see Cal Rodgers with the plane and a variety of dignitaries as he gets ready to take off. An important point here is that he symbolically carries mail to dignitaries in both Chicago and Pasadena, though none of these letters have known to survive. But it also starts to plant the seed about airplanes and air travel, if you will, being a mechanism by which mail can be transferred. And of course, this wasn't new with Cal Rodgers' endeavor here, but certainly he was going to show that it was a potentially viable approach. Now, here in this photo here, Cal Rodgers is with someone from the Vin Fiz company, part of Armour, and then his niece and nephew. And the niece, Martha's family, becomes an interesting part of the story later on. So they get ready to take off. They christen the plane by pouring a bottle of Vin Fiz over the plane skids, and off he goes. He takes off from the beginning of this adventure. Now, this flight is not well known. Some might argue that it's as significant as any other major aviation achievements in U.S. history, but it's kind of lost to history for a variety of reasons, and we'll come back to that as well. But there he goes, he's off. Now, while the Rodgers Aerial Post has not been created yet, during this period of time, collecting postcards was a pretty significant hobby and endeavor by many people. So there are a lot of postcards that commemorate his travels, and I'll show a few of those in a moment here. But for this part of the presentation, I just want you to kind of get your mind into being in the year 1911 and what is aviation like. Trips are very difficult. How do you land? How do you find suitable landing places? You have to avoid things like power lines. Weather forecasting doesn't exist, in the way we think of it today. So how do you manage flying with weather? Obviously, how do you maintain this airplane, again, which is kind of primitive technology, and it's undergoing a pretty significant and a harsh trip. So maintaining the state of the airplane becomes a real challenge during this. And as I mentioned earlier, Cal was responsible for the ongoing support of his plane while he's flying. So along the way, Wettengel and John Rodgers, they planned for him to land in certain cities to perform air shows to raise funds. And as he goes across the country, he's greeted by thousands of people everywhere. This becomes a major news event in the United States during the time. And in fact, many newspapers, cover publish a ghostwritten article by Cal Rodgers during this trip. But I wanted to set the story because I'm just going to run through the first, few weeks of his trip to give you an idea how difficult it was. I'm going to kind of go through this pretty quickly. So he, day 2, he lands in Middleton, New York. He goes to take off and he crashes into a chicken coop, killing several chicken. He had to pay the farmer for the death of those chickens, and he crashed because he ran into power lines. He loses 3 days. By the time he takes off again, he gets lost because he loses his way going down the wrong railroad track, following the wrong railroad track, ends up in Pennsylvania. When he lands, he has to go try to find some gas and has to go buy some gas before he gets back on course. He gets to Elmira, New York, and he's delayed by hitting power lines. He lands at the end of the 24th in Hornell, New York. But if you take a look at the picture, along the way, he stopped in Olean, New York. And when he took off, you can see with the back of the plane, he's dragging hay from the field. He landed in a large grass field, and when he took off, he got hung up in some hay, and that kind of took off with him. He crashes again in New York. Again, 3 days lost. When he finally takes off, he flies into Pennsylvania, and he flies over Akron, Ohio, and he lands in Kent, Ohio, after flying 204 miles on the 28th. And in Kent, Ohio, again, a large crowd turns out. But the significance of this event is highlighted by the quote that you see here on this postcard. Passed over Kent, first airship I ever saw, will ever remember this day. So again, the significance of this as a technological advancement in the United States really caught the attention of the American people following Cal Rodgers' trip. So he ends up on his way flying to into Kent, Ohio. He lands in Marion, Ohio, where he's met by Warren G. Harding, who at the time, long before becoming president, is the publisher of the local newspaper. And from here, he flies into Indiana to Huntington. So you get a sense here. Look at all the time he loses. He's on a 30-day schedule to fly cross country. And every time he has a plane crash, it takes several days to fix it. So the crash really becomes a problem. And then when he goes to take off from Huntington, Indiana, finally, after getting there after some bad weather, he has another serious crash. And this time, the crash is caused by not hitting something, but avoiding spectators. As I said, several thousand people came out to see him, and crowd control was almost non-existent. And many times, spectators got in his way. And in fact, spectators here caused this significant crash. He realizes he can't achieve the Hearst Prize, but he decides to go on to Pasadena anyway, and he needs to raise funds. And I really like this picture. You see Charlie Taylor, the chief mechanic, hands on hip, yet another long day of repairs. Now, John Rodgers replaces Fred Wettengel as the manager at this point in time, and Cal, along with Mabel and John, decide that they're going to have to come up with some new fundraising ideas. So they write this booklet, which is written, if you will, by Cal Rodgers, called The Story of My Flying. And this is a replica from the Jackknight Airmail Society that was redone in 1954. And it's very interesting because what Cal Rodgers basically says in here is part of his story is, I don't expect to reach Los Angeles in 30 days to win the prize, but I have nothing to lose on this trip but my neck and my machine. So again, this adventurous spirit is really kind of embodied in who this person is, Cal Rodgers. And I think this picture is very telling because he includes a diagram of the plane. And I think here it's pretty obvious how fragile this machine is. And he's flying across country through all types of weather conditions and the like. And it's pretty amazing. So what the other thing, the other fundraising endeavor they undertake is they create or define this service called the Rodgers Aerial Post. And what it is that Mabel will offer postcards to be carried on the Vin Fiz, which will cost 25 cents to do so. And it'll be stamped with a cachet that will read, carried by Rodgers Aeroplane Vin Fiz. And then when he lands, those postcards will then be put into the mail. But part of the trip is, if you will, airmail through the Rodgers Aerial Post. And Mabel actually uses the term postmistress in describing this service, the Rodgers Aerial Post, and that becomes controversial for the rest of her life. Now, just a quick aside, while Cal is traveling from New York, Earl Overington actually officially becomes the first person to officially carry airmail sanctioned by the U.S. Post Office Department by the Postmaster General, Frank Hitchcock, on September 23rd, 1911. So, in fact, even though Cal was carrying mail, it was unofficial. And this particular event here, obviously, really superseded anything that the Rodgerses could claim relative to their Rodgers Aerial Post. But what's interesting here is that also Overington, says that he's going to also, go on a transcontinental flight. He takes off on October 11th. He crashes on takeoff, and he just stops right there and never continues. So, the Rodgerses, especially Cal Rodgers, they feel somewhat snubbed. Cal and Mabel, as I said, clearly overstate their role with respect to the Rodgers Aerial Post. And as I said, Mabel, as late as 1965, as she lived on, claimed that she had this official status as this postmistress, even though there's no government records to say that she ever received this commission. So this is just kind of the background going on, if you will, around airmail at the time and the impact it has with respect to the Rodgers Aerial Post. Now back to the Rodgers, how is the Rodgers Aerial Post realized? So now that this has been established, he's leaving Indiana. He arrives in Chicago. He delivers the Sheepshead letters as he committed to do, and he conducts an air show at Grant Park. And in one of the local newspapers, it says Rodgers is demonstrating the ability of carrying mail by airplane. So again, this notion that the plane can be used to transport mail continues to be part of the story here. After Chicago, after the Grant Park event, he performs air shows in Peoria and Springfield. And as I mentioned, a lot of people were buying and sending postcards, having seen Rodgers at these various events. And this is an example of one of those postcards. And these become significant collector's items, even to this day, selling for several $100s at auction. And we'll talk a bit more about this as well. So, so now he's, working his way through Illinois as part of his trip westward. And, here's a photograph of him, actually flying into Springfield Fairgrounds. Now he crosses the Mississippi on October 10th. So now he's going to be making $4 per mile versus $5. But when he lands in Marshall, he sets a U.S. distance record of 1,398 miles in terms of the longest flight by any American at that point in time. And Marshall is also where the first known piece of Vin Fiz mail originated. And as you can see in this picture, and there's only a couple of these postcards in existence, you can see that the sort of primitive purple cachet has been stamped there that, it was, flown on the Vin Fiz. And, what happened was it originated in Marshall, and when Cal landed in Kansas City, Mabel mailed this on to Concordia, Missouri, where it was addressed to. So this is the first piece of mail, if you will, that flew on the Vin Fiz that carried the cachet, recognizing the creation of the Rodgers aerial post. Now, Kansas City's, as mentioned, is an interesting stop because this is where Cal's family is. He has an uncle there, Robert Slidell Rodgers, who is his uncle, and he sends a postcard to his brother, John Augustus Rodgers in Maryland. And this is a second known postcard that carries this stamped cachet. This crude picture comes from an airmail journal from the 1930s. Now, what's interesting is Robert is a Kansas City attorney, but he's also a stamp collector and a member of the APS. And he proposes replacing the cachet with a printed stamp that he designs. And as you can see the stamp there, it shows the plane, the Vin Fiz. It acknowledges the Rodgers aerial post. And this will now be used, if you will, to frank further mail that is carried while Cal Rodgers is making this trip from east to west. And it's the first use of an airplane of any kind, an image of an airplane of any kind, or any type of paid stamp. Now, so Robert took delivery of initial order. A few were made available for use by Mabel, and others would be shipped to her. But unfortunately, Robert contracted pneumonia, never recovered, and passed away in early 1912. So somewhere in here is a history of most likely many lost copies of the Vin Fiz stamps, if you will, and only a few are survived to be used on this trip, and even obviously fewer survive to this day in various forms. And I'll talk about that. So carrying on now with the trip, the first known use of the Vin Fiz stamp was on a postcard that was flown from Kansas City to Veneta, Oklahoma on October 14th. And it was mailed to a person named Nettie Strawn by her fiance, E.N. McCormick. And you can see it here, a standard postcard with the 1 cent franking with the Rodgers aerial post stamp on it as part of the commemorative effort to raise money. Cal flew on to McAlester, Oklahoma, where he took off on October 17th. And then Cal flew 265 miles on that day from McAlester to Fort Worth, which was a single day distance record. But on the train, to Fort Worth, Jasper Allen, a newspaper editor, purchased a stamp and a postcard that he mailed to his wife. And it was during this trip that Jasper Allen interviewed Mabel, and again, she pushes this notion that she is a postmistress, and she's authorized to be selling stamps and representing the postal system. Now, this is the address side of the card. Now, here's the picture side of the card. You can see that the stamp was actually applied on the picture side of the postcard, not on the traditional address side like in the previous example. Now, this stamp was removed from the card in 1964 and was, reunited, if you will. And what you see here is an image that predates 1964, so you can see what it looked like when the stamp was applied by Jasper Allen. And again, as I mentioned, Allen writes of Mabel as a postmistress, and it's unclear why, other than she probably was pushing him to validate what she believes to be true here. So he flies on to Dallas. Again, he's welcomed at a state fairground by thousands of people. And these events really cause a problem for Cal Rodgers because, again, crowd control is not really well done. Many people try to rip off pieces of fabric for souvenir or sign the plane or generally disrupt its maintenance. And again, he has to, along with trying to make this trip, he has to try to secure the plane whenever he lands it. Now, while in Texas, another postcard was flown to Waco on October 19th, mail and postmark there. This was mailed to Clinton, Texas. It's another example. Now, here's an interesting one. This card was flown from Dallas, mailed at Waco, and it was sent to New York and signed by Charlie Taylor using his nickname Zach. It was a birthday greeting to someone in his family. And so it's another example of the postcard being used, in this case, not strictly as a souvenir remembrance of the flight, but he used it as part of a birthday greeting, if you will. In Waco, Cal was administered administered an oath as a mail carrier. It's somewhat symbolic, but it did occur. And again, this background sort of story of the Rodgers family trying to position themselves in some level of being, officially in the role of carrying the mail when they really weren't. So they continue to fly on. Jasper Allen buys another stamp, affixes, sends a postcard, this time, from Dallas to San Antonio. And in this particular one, it goes to, instead of his wife, it goes to the Dallas paper. It's interesting, in this example, the stamp was applied along the edge and folded over. Later it was repaired so you can see it in the condition in which it's shown in this picture. And again, wherever he went, he drew large crowds. And here's an example of all the people that came out to see him in San Antonio, as now he turns west to Pasadena. But after taking off from San Antonio, he lands in Spofford, Texas, where he, when goes to take off, he crashes on the 25th, and the plane is delayed a day to be repaired. He's writing these articles that are published nationally, and he muses in one of those articles that this is just a small wreck, part of the game, but of course unwelcome. This picture is interesting, I think, because you get a really good idea as to sort of the billboard effect that the Vin Fiz had on the plane, because as you can see in the underwing here, it's pretty prominently displayed that he's flying for the Vin Fiz company. Now, when he's on his way from Texas into New Mexico, from Spofford, he lands in Sanderson, Texas. And here's an example of a Vin Fiz stamp souvenir card that was purchased in Spofford and carried to Sanderson, where it's postmarked on the 27th. So this is the picture side. This is the very traditional, the more common Rodgers aerial postcard that Mabel sold. And here you can see on the address side the stamp being affixed. While he's traveling, this picture I found kind of fun, because it shows him refueling the plane. It was unusual for him to do maintenance on his plane, but he did. And every picture you see of Cal Rodgers, he always has his signature cigar, but obviously he's refueling here, so not a good idea to be having the cigar at the same time. Now, what happens is that there is a recently discovered, recently it was found last year and auctioned in December of last year, December 2023, of a postcard that was postmarked in El Paso, addressed to Arden, Texas, that was written in Sanderson. It's the only known cover to travel on this leg. So this is a standard, again, Vin Fiz postcard with the stamp affixed this time to the picture side. But you'll notice that the auction, it was offered for $75,000 and sold for $112,000. So there's been a lot of, I'd say in the last 10 years, some Vin Fiz material being auctioned off, and the prices have really been, pretty high, much higher than what they were originally offered for. And here's a photograph of the Vin Fiz leaving Texas after spending 2 weeks and over 1,000 miles in the state of Texas. And he makes a comment again in one of these daily newspaper articles that he's been flying for miles and miles, and Texas is longer than any other 3 states in the union, is a comment he makes. He enters New Mexico into Deming, New Mexico, and Mabel sold a Vin Fiz stamp that was affixed to the only known cover. So this is everything else was a postcard or a standalone stamp that survives, but this is the only known cover that was that was postmarked in when he flies to Imperial, California, was postmarked there, and then eventually on to Oakland. This cover sold about 10 years ago for about $100,000. And so he flies out of New Mexico and lands in Wilcox, Arizona. Now, in Wilcox, Arizona, a stamp was sold to a CF Thiel in Wilcox, and it's flown on a leg and eventually gets postmarked in Pasadena. Its destination was to Cologne, Germany. And this postcard is the most significant of all the Vin Fiz postcards. So, first of all, the letter on the postcard, reads, from this person, Mr. Thiel, to Otto Munzner, who is in fact works at an umbrella factory in Cologne, Germany, and you can see that on the cover of the card. But he writes in there, basically, I did this as this transcontinental Rodgers flight was happening, but please attach, this to your stamp collection. So it's the first time during this whole Rodgers aerial post and the flight of the Vin Fiz, there's any notion of the stamps and what's going on as being collectible as philatelic material. Certainly the souvenirs were there commemorating the flight, but here's the first time where the notion of philatelic material is discussed. So this is not a souvenir card. It's a postal card, a penny postcard, if you will, franked with an additional 1 cent Franklin stamp to pay for international travel. So it's the only card that flew outside the United States, in this case to Germany. In the year 1925, this stamp on this card is identified as the first time the Vin Fiz is collectible, if you will. And it all comes from this exchange, because clearly the sender is sending it to a person who is a philatelist. So he moves on from Wilcox to Tucson, and in Tucson he meets Robert Fowler, who's on his quest for the Hertz Prize, going from west to east. They have some greetings. Like Cal, Fowler knew he was never going to win the prize, and he ended his trip in Florida in February of 1912. There was another Hertz Prize attempt made by a person named James Ward, who also tried to fly from west to east, and he also unfortunately was unsuccessful. So what happens, he continues to fly across Arizona, and it's this point in time where his mother sends 3 postcards along the trip. The first one, this very crude picture of it appeared in a historical airmail catalog from the 1930s. It was postmarked in Imperial Junction, California, and it was addressed to Cal's sister, Martha Pease, who was the mother of the little girl we saw in the earlier slide when he was taking off. What's really fascinating is that this cover was unknown and came to light in 2020 based upon the article that Ken Lawrence wrote in 2019 that I had a footnote on the cover page about. So because of that article, this cover came to light. Its whereabouts was unknown, but now it's known, and it resides within the Rodgers family, if you will. She sent another postcard, to herself, addressed to a Los Angeles hotel. Again, this was the second one she sent. And then finally, there was one that was addressed to a Mrs. McKnight in Pittsburgh. And again, this was flown in the leg here, and it was postmarked in Imperial Junction. So these 3 cards, along with the Deming letter, were kind of bunched up and were all, postmarked in Imperial. And in all cases, these postal cards were this very traditional souvenir card that we've seen before. Now, here's some interesting notes. As he makes his way across Arizona, he has a situation where he runs out of gas. He lands in a place called Stovall Siding, and he's by himself. He's literally by himself. He has to spend the night while he waits for the train to catch up to him so he can refuel his plane. And while waiting there, a group of Native Americans, come up to him, and he actually is quite concerned, that he might get attacked because they don't know what's going on. And he can't really communicate with them. And they refer to him as the Great White Bird. So, very sort of rural situation occurred for him. Now, so he takes off, and then he crash lands in Imperial Junction, California. And if you take a look at the photograph in the upper right, the reason he had to crash land is the engine exploded. And you can see by that picture, the explosion of the engine is pretty severe. And you can see in the photograph, Cal working with Charles Wiggin and another one of his support crew, trying to fix the plane. But from a philatelic standpoint, what's really interesting is, as I mentioned, 4 Vin Fiz either postcards or covers were canceled in Imperial Junction, which had a tiny post office for 64 residents. And that post office existed for a very short period of time, about 20 months. And it's today another town, Niland, California, but it's the home of 4 of the Vin Fiz 13 postmarks. After departing Imperial Junction, finally, after repairing the plane, they make a planned stop. He has to spend more time, doing additional repairs before he heads off to his last stop, being Pasadena, where he lands in Pasadena on November 5th, successfully completing the first transcontinental flight across the United States. He receives, accolades after landing, talks to the press and the like. It took 49 days, so he didn't make the Hearst Prize, which was 30 days. They offered him a Silver Cup trophy, sort of as a consolation prize in a way, and he just refuses to accept it after all he went through. He delivers the last of the letters, Sheepshead letters. There were 20,000 people at this tournament park in Pasadena when he lands, to welcome him. And now that he's completed the trip, he ends his business relationship with the armor company, and the Vin Fiz promotion effectively comes to an end. But he decides he's going to carry on to Long Beach because he wants to put the plane, bring the plane to the Pacific Ocean. And so he plans to depart on November 12th to do so. And what's kind of an interesting footnote, if you will, there was an effort to build a significant monument to his achievement, and funds were being raised in 1911 and 1912 to do so. The money was never successfully raised. So the only commemoration of this event is this rather kind of mundane marker that was placed in 1962, at the site of his landing. So when he goes to take off for the Pacific Ocean at Long Beach, he has a very significant crash in Compton, California. Now, it just so happens there was another cache created for this leg of the journey from Pasadena to Long Beach. And as you can see, an additional stamp was added that says it all. The machine was wrecked at Compton. At Compton, the aviator was injured. And in fact, Cal was significantly injured, broke both ankles, and had to spend about a month convalescing. And here he's pictured with his mother and his wife. Now, when he finally recovers well enough, the Vin Fiz is restored, and he's going to fly on to Long Beach on December 10th. And you can see he still requires crutches to walk, and he's going to fly the plane with those crutches strapped to the wings. And by this point in time, the plane, other than a few pieces, has been completely rebuilt. So he lands in the Pacific Ocean. He reaches the Pacific Ocean on December 10th, 1911, making it literally, or actually, I should say, coast to coast. Of course, there was a souvenir postcard to commemorate it. And if you look carefully, you'll see his crutches strapped to his wing. Now, this poster that was produced by the Armor Meat Packing Company is a great simple view of his trip from the East Coast to the West Coast and all the stops along the way. I can obviously send Todd this information if you're interested in looking at this, but this is at the Smithsonian. And here are just some stats from the flight. Over 4,000 miles, his average speed was about 51 miles an hour. As mentioned, it took 49 days. His actual flying time was 3 days, 10 hours, and 4 minutes. And this is a record that stood for 8 years, about 8 years. And when you think about technology advancing at the rate at which aviation was at this point in time, and for this record to stand for that long is an absolutely incredible accomplishment. And then here's just some statistics about the single longest flight, longest legs, etc., and the amount of gasoline that was consumed. Now, when you think about this for a moment, just kind of now let's look at it from a philatelic point of view. As mentioned, the stamp that was affixed to the umbrella factory addressee, if you will, that stamp gets described in the 1925 German airmail book with a sort of terse description of what the stamp is, but this is the first time it's ever discussed. And you can see the time that lapsed between that postcard and its discussion in the philatelic literature is a significant amount of time. It's described in the United States in December 1929 American Airmail Society Air Post Journal, and it goes into great detail about the flight itself. And it's also in this particular issue of the APJ that the stamp is first described in the United States, as well as a description of the Rodgers aerial post. So here we are, a few years later, before it gets any acknowledgement in the United States. There's sort of a lull period now, even though Mabel Rodgers is out promoting the fact that she had done this up until the 1960s. But the Collectors Club Philatelist has a very extensive set of articles about this that were written by Henry Goodkind, that again to describe not only the flight but the philatelic history of it. And it really is fascinating that it wasn't until 1993 that the Scott Specialized Catalog of United States Stamps and Covers acknowledged both the Buffalo Balloon as well as the Rodgers aerial post by having air post semi-official stamps being described and now part of that catalog. So it eventually found its place into, let's say, some proper philatelic documents, if you will, or journals and the like. Now how are these? How is this trip, if you will, memorialized philatelically? So first is that the covers that were hand stamped early on in Marshall, Missouri, which a few are two of them are known, I believe. I don't think I've never uncovered knowing any more than two of them. These purple stamp cachets are very rare, and obviously they commemorate the flight philatelically. Then there's obviously the set of postcards, the one postal card and the one cover that have the stamp on it. That's another way in which people view the philatelic history of this flight. And then the covers that were carried from Pasadena to Long Beach that suffered the Compton crash were the other flown materials, if you will. These are the three flown materials that were part of the Vin Fiz legacy. And by the way, none of the ceremonial letters that he carried from New York to both Chicago and Pasadena are known to have survived. So this really makes the catalog, if you will, of the Vin Fiz flown material. Now, collecting Vin Fiz, in addition to, if you have obviously the means, meaning $100,000 to buy, if they ever come up at auction, the previous philatelic material just described, people do collect Vin Fiz postcards that commemorate the flight along the way. So the people writing about it as they saw it as Cal Rodgers went across the country. But even these postcards at auction, sell for several $100s. Just blank postcards are also of collectors' interest, and people do collect those. And then finally, people do collect anniversary covers, of which there's, many hundreds of examples of this. But I will draw your attention to the cover on the right. Now, this cover was signed by Mabel Rodgers, and she continues to describe herself here. You see the first aerial postmistress. But if you look very carefully, you'll notice that her name is Mabel Rodgers Wiggin. Later in life, she married Charles Wiggin, and the two of them, through the 1940s and 50s, were accused of counterfeiting several postcards and selling them as authentic. So there's a whole nother talk about the validity of some of the covers that they actually handled, but they're not presented in this discussion here. Now, let me just give you a quick wrap up here, an epilogue to the story. So Cal Rodgers, he stayed in California. He got a new plane, a Wright Model B, and he was pretty famous. He sold rides and he gave demonstrations, but like anybody who's famous, as time went on, he kind of faded into yesterday's news. And in fact, he did fly over the Tournament of Roses parade in 1912, dropping roses. But Cal, unfortunately, he came to, his death came quickly thereafter. He died in April 1912 while flying off Long Beach, which is somewhat ironic given that's where he landed his plane in the ocean. And it was believed he flew into a flock of seagulls and he died upon impact when he lost control of the plane. And you can see it's a pretty dramatic crash when you take a look at the picture on the right of the wreckage. So he died, at a young age, but it wasn't uncommon for some of these early, aerial pioneers, if you will, to die or to be killed in such events. So, unfortunately for him, he met the fate of many of his peers. Now, he was returned home, if you will, to Pittsburgh, where he is buried. On his, grave marker, there's a picture of the Vin Fiz in flight, and a quote on the bottom of the monument that says, "I endure, I conquer." And what's kind of a shame is that there's no commemorative stamp has ever been issued to celebrate his accomplishment. Now, I don't want to end on such a downbeat note. So what happened to the Vin Fiz itself, the flyer? So Mabel exhibited the plane for 2 years after his death, but Cal's mother sued Mabel, and in 1914 won possession of the plane. And after this, the two women never spoke again. The plane was brought into the possession of the family, and Cal's brother, had the plane restored, and he offered it to the Smithsonian, but they refused to accept it because they already had a plane, a Wright Model B type flyer in their possession. So the restored plane was brought to the Carnegie Institute in Pittsburgh, and there it is on display shortly after it arrived there. In 1933, during the Century of Progress World's Fair, it was again offered, and this time the Smithsonian reconsidered and took possession of the plane. After that, and there it is on display in the Smithsonian Museum. This picture taken sometime in the 1960s, and there it is in the Smithsonian Museum, on display. I'm not going to say as of today because the Air and Space Museum has undergone some significant renovations. But in the most recent version of the Air and Space Museum, there's the plane, obviously completely reconstructed, but on display for the public to see and wonder, what is this all about? So that's the end of it. Thank you.
That was awesome.
Very nice.
Thank you. Now,
I did not give up.
No, it's a fabulous story. It really is. And I'm just going to show you, because we have just a moment here, one last slide. I'll put this in build mode again really quick. So this is called the Stein Map, and it was in, I'm going to give you a couple of references. And also I have a couple, I'll get to this in a moment. But this book called The Flight of the Vin Fiz, written by E.P. Stein. This map is a very close, accurate representation of his flight. But E.B. Stein was a Hollywood scriptwriter, so his book is not completely accurate and has a significant number of embellishments in it. but it's a good read. The American Heritage Magazine in 1964, kind of right after the 50th anniversary of the flight of the Vin Fiz, sort of for the popular consumption of Americans, if you will, as a very detailed article, several pages long, about the flight. But the real reference, if you're really interested in this, is this book here by Eileen Lebo. This book was supported by the Smithsonian as a very accurate representation of the flight and the story, though not philately. It's just about the flight itself. And here's the article I referenced at the very beginning by Kim Lawrence from 2019, which in fact is really, if you really want to read, the definitive story of the Vin Fiz, both the flight and the philatelic history, that's the article you should read. So at that point, I will stop sharing. And if you guys had any questions or comments, certainly I'd love to hear it.
Anybody have any questions?
Just a comment. I think you really intertwined the story behind the philatelic aspect of it very nicely. I love the way you did it.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I'll be honest with you. I mean, I even though I was not a historian professionally, I wanted to be as a kid. So whenever I look at anything about the philatelic part of the story, the history also, I always find really fascinating. So I appreciate you saying that, and thank you.
I'm going to stop the recording.